Nighttime in Atlanta was never exactly pleasant, especially not in the old industrial district on the city's south side. Once a bustling manufacturing hub, now nothing but skeletons of warehouses, rusting corrugated roofs, and tattered billboards swinging in the wind like ghosts clinging to memories. No one came here after dark, except smugglers, dealers hiding illicit goods, and a handful of cops who hadn't yet forgotten what it felt like to work in silence, in a city that always kept secrets tucked behind its cracked concrete walls. Officer Sarah Collins stepped out of her patrol car, eyes scanning the unnervingly still surroundings. But it wasn't her who sensed the anomaly first. It was Hugo, the sand-colored Belgian Malinois, his muscular frame encased in a K9 vest, his watchful eyes carrying a quiet awareness that seemed to see what humans could not. The moment Sarah's boots touched the uneven pavement, Hugo froze. Not a bark, not a growl, just a sudden stillness, his entire body taut. He tilted his head, nostrils twitching as he turned slightly into the wind, then stopped again, like a marker in time holding its breath. Sarah felt the tension in the leash, not a panicked tug, but a signal. Something's not right. She halted, eyes falling on her silent companion, the one who had stood beside her during drug busts, who had shielded her from gunfire during a hostage rescue in Eastlake, and who, more than anyone, had understood the loneliness of a cop working the night shift. Hugo didn't need words. That charged silence was the warning. A breeze swept through, carrying the faint sting of burnt plastic, rotting metal, and something else. Something different. Sarah didn't recognize it. But Hugo did. It was the scent of a life interrupted. Sweat and tears, things no advanced tech could detect. But Hugo's nose never failed. When Sarah followed the direction of his gaze, she knew this night wouldn't end with just another report. Hugo moved, slow but determined, navigating through overgrown weeds and shattered glass. Sarah followed, flashlight sweeping over moss-covered walls and chaotic graffiti. Distorted faces, nonsensical symbols, like the city's own breathless confessions. The silence was so deep she could hear her breathing, the soft clink of Hugo's lead with every step. They crossed what used to be a freight parking lot, now nothing more than a forgotten stage where untold stories still lingered like mist. Then, Hugo stopped. He lowered himself, eyes sharp and shadowed like blades, locked on a dense thicket in the far corner. When Sarah's flashlight flicked across the underbrush, a chill ran down her spine. A black SUV materialized from the dark, as if it had always belonged there. But Sarah knew it didn't. This wasn't like the abandoned, decaying vehicles scattered around. Its paint was immaculate, untouched. Not a scratch, not a speck of dirt, like it had been washed clean, only to be hidden on purpose. The windows were blacked out, so dark that not even a silhouette could be seen inside. No plates, no logos, and what unnerved her most, it didn't reflect light. Under her beam, the SUV looked like a void suspended in reality. Hugo let out a low growl. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the night like a whisper from a nightmare. Sarah's hand instinctively found the grip of her holstered gun, the other tightened around her flashlight. She didn't know what lay waiting inside that vehicle, but Hugo did, and his eyes told her, "Trust me, someone's in there, and they're running out of time." She knelt beside him, whispered, "Find them, boy. Show me the truth." And Hugo, like always, didn't hesitate. He stepped into the dark. Not with fear, not with doubt, but with the unwavering belief that no matter how deep the night, as long as he was by her side, they would find the light. The darkness thickened around them as Hugo crept closer to the SUV, each step heavy and deliberate, as if he were feeling the weight of something hidden behind that cold, metallic shell. Then suddenly, without warning, he snarled, a deep, guttural sound, sharp like a knife tearing through silence, followed by a bark. But it wasn't the controlled alert of a trained K9 identifying drugs or explosives. This was raw, frantic, almost pleading. Sarah's chest tightened. Never, in all their years together, had she heard Hugo bark like that. Not a signal, but a cry for help from a creature who knew, more than any human ever could, that behind that metal shell, a life was slipping away. Sarah swept her light across the SUV's body. Her eyes caught every detail. The thin layer of dust on the windshield, too evenly spread to be natural. The still damp mud under the wheels suggesting it had arrived less than an hour ago. And most of all, the driver's door handle. Eerily clean, with no prints, no oil, no sweat. The kind of spotless only fanatics knew how to pull off. She'd seen it before, in vanish without a trace cases, where DNA had been scrubbed with special solvents, footprints masked with rubber padding, where the perpetrators didn't just avoid law enforcement, they erased their victims from existence. Hugo kept barking, faster, more urgent. He clawed frantically at the back of the SUV, his nails screeching against the metal, his voice rising not just in alarm, but in fury and desperation, as if, in that dark space, Hugo wasn't just smelling blood, but fear, despair, the soul of someone drowning in silence. The hairs on Sarah's neck stood up. She reached for her radio, calling for backup. Her voice remained composed, but her eyes never left Hugo, and her heart couldn't shake the growing certainty. Inside that vehicle was a victim, maybe the last chance for their story to be heard. The protocol said she should wait, but something deeper pulled her forward. Not duty, but the invisible thread between two souls who had saved each other more than once. Then came the sound, a thump from inside the trunk. 3 soft, rapid knocks, a small fist banging against an invisible prison. Hugo howled, an anguished, piercing cry that shattered what little calm Sarah had left. There was no doubt anymore, no room for hesitation. She whispered to herself, part apology, part vow. Sorry, procedure this time, I trust you. And in that moment, amid the haunting silence of a forgotten district, with her heart racing and Hugo's eyes burning like a beacon, Sarah reached for the trunk, where the dark could no longer hide the truth. What she didn't know was that the one who placed that SUV there wasn't just a criminal. He was a ghost in the system, a puppeteer in a cross-state human trafficking ring, untouchable, uncharged, and watching them from afar, with a thin, cold smile, waiting to see if the woman would dare break the rules for the sake of a dog's conviction. And if she did, the game would begin. The trunk door clicked open with a cold, hollow snap, like the final sound that awakens a nightmare long sealed away in darkness. A wave of stale air rushed out, thick with the stench of dried blood, scorched plastic, and a fear so heavy it seemed to cling to every molecule. Hugo stepped back half a pace, but his eyes stayed fixed on the void inside. When Sarah shone her flashlight into the cramped space, her breath caught in her throat. Curled up inside was a frail body, drawn in so tight it seemed even the bones were trying to retreat from the world. Her eyes, wide open, shimmered with terror that hadn't yet faded. Her cracked lips parted in shallow, bird-like gasps, as if she'd been buried alive in her pain. The girl couldn't have been older than 20. Her long hair was matted and tangled, and one side of her face was smeared with dried blood. Her wrists were bound tightly with industrial zip ties, deep enough to tear the skin and leave bruises like storm clouds circling her bones. But what kept Sarah's gaze locked wasn't just the girl. It was what lay beside her. A laptop, already powered on, its faint screen flickering against her sunken cheeks. In Hugo's eyes, that same flicker was reflected, like a silent alarm only he could see. Dozens of surveillance windows filled the screen, each showing a different confined space. Concrete walls cracked with decay, rusted doors, flickering lights casting pale shadows over emaciated bodies. Mostly women. A few teenagers. One child, no older than 5, curled in a corner clutching a one-eyed teddy bear. Sarah's chest tightened, not with rage, but with the crushing weight of helplessness. These places were real. These people were real, and they existed in the same city she had once believed she knew. Then, from the girl's cracked throat came a whisper, so soft it was barely there. "There are more. He's coming back." That voice wasn't just a warning, it was a confession. A last fragment of memory torn from the dark curtain someone had desperately tried to keep closed. Hugo whimpered, low and guttural, full of sorrow. He had smelled this kind of despair before, buried his head in blood-stained crime scenes that most people only read about. But now, his eyes weren't those of a trained K9. They were the eyes of a soldier staring at an old wound torn open. In that small, broken girl, he saw echoes of the pain he had once felt behind metal bars. Sarah reached for the zip ties, her hands careful and gentle, as if afraid the girl might shatter with the slightest wrong move. Even as she worked, Sarah's eyes never left the laptop. Lines of code scrolled across the screen, IP addresses, encrypted pathways, military-grade data strings. One thing was clear, this wasn't just a trafficking ring, it was a network, a system, an invisible hand woven through layers of power no one dared to challenge. And deeper still, buried in hidden folders, a logo, a familiar symbol she had seen once before, buried in a redacted FBI file on a human trafficking case that had been wiped clean due to lack of evidence. Now she knew. This was it. What Hugo had sensed not just with his nose, but with memory, with instinct, with a scar that had never truly healed. She turned to Hugo, knelt, and gently touched his head, just as she had before every mission. Her voice was steady, quiet, and sure. "We just touched something darker than the world wants to admit exists, and I think it knows we're here." On the screen, one camera blinked out, then a second, a third, as if someone, somewhere far away, was watching and had begun erasing every trace. But it was too late. They had seen. Hugo had seen. And this time, if the man behind all this came back, he'd face something he couldn't possibly anticipate. A dog once discarded, now reborn as a warrior with no fear. Because what Hugo protected wasn't just justice. It was the fragile lives still waiting to hope. Sarah had just zipped the laptop into an evidence bag and bent to check the girl's wounds when Hugo suddenly turned, let out a sharp growl, and launched himself into the shadows behind the warehouse, an arrow of instinct piercing the night. No command, no hesitation. He had sensed something. Someone. The presence of a figure lurking in the dark, who had been watching, waiting. The scent of synthetic skin, cold sweat, and metal, an old nightmare crashing back into the now. Sarah whipped around. Her flashlight barely caught the blur of a figure darting between the ruined buildings, tall, lean, and moving like a shadow slipping beneath moonlight before vanishing completely. Without a second thought, she fired a flare into the sky and sprinted after Hugo, her heart pounding like a war drum summoned by intuition. Hugo's footsteps echoed ahead, steady, forceful, echoing through the narrow hallways of an old factory. The walls crumbled with age, corrugated iron hung loose, and the ground sparkled with broken glass-like teeth, waiting in the dark. Each step Sarah took was filled with dread, not of the figure they chased, but of what might happen to Hugo without her. Over the years, he had learned to protect her like breath itself. And for that reason, he was always the first into danger, unflinching, unyielding, the shield between her and every threat the world could offer. They passed through a derelict warehouse where moonlight sliced through holes in the roof like blades. Hugo was gone from view. Sarah called out, once, then again, her voice growing hoarse. No answer, only the echo of her footsteps, swallowed by silence. She stopped, spun in place, gun drawn, every sense burning. And then, her flashlight caught a dark smear on the concrete. Drops. Red. Fresh. Blood. She swallowed hard, her hand trembling. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she followed the trail down a narrow corridor. At the end, beneath a metal staircase, lay a torn K9 vest, scorched at the side, singed fur stuck to the fabric. The name tag swung in the flashlight beam, tapping out a silent cry for help. Sarah knelt, fingers grazing the scorched edge. The heat of dread bloomed in her chest. Then her phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. No name, no image, just 6 words. Want to save him? Come alone. She clenched the phone. The words bit into her skin. Her eyes stayed fixed on the discarded vest as if Hugo had just been there seconds ago. Her thoughts reeled, fear and fury swirling in equal parts. Not rage at the world, but at whoever was cruel enough to take Hugo, not for leverage, but because they knew. They knew he was her heart. And now they weren't just abducting a dog. They were testing her soul, playing a brutal game without violence, taking the only one she trusted unconditionally. And in that split second, Sarah understood. These people didn't just want ransom, didn't just traffic bodies, didn't just erase evidence. They knew who Hugo was. They'd been watching, waiting, and they struck not to kill but to break, to force a choice between duty and love. But Sarah? She didn't break. She never had and never would. She stood, her eyes blazed, not with rage, but with the cold, burning resolve of someone who has lost too much to lose again. Her feet moved, steady and unwavering. She didn't look back. And in her heart, a silent vow rose with each step on the blood-warm concrete. Wait for me, Hugo, even if I have to walk into hell alone. I will bring you home. Underground, where the air was stale and cold, and light existed only as a dim, sickly yellow, Sarah descended the iron staircase into a basement that every instinct told her was a trap, a place where darkness wasn't just the absence of light but something soaked into every breath. The last message on her phone vanished, replaced by a new image. Not text, but a grainy surveillance photo, blurred by poor lighting and a low-quality lens, yet clear enough to crush her chest. In the frame was Hugo, chained to a steel post at the center of a circular cement pit. A thick, heavy collar, one used in brutal training camps, dug into his neck. His back was soaked, maybe with sweat, maybe with blood, maybe both. His eyes were wide open, startlingly clear, not panicked, not angry, just silent. The kind of silence that only comes from creatures who have been locked away too long and have learned how to endure it. Sarah didn't need directions to know where this was. She recognized it instantly, from the color of the walls, the rusted fencing, the circular ring. It was one of the illegal dogfighting pits she and the K9 unit had tried to shut down 3 years ago, a place where dogs were forced to fight to the death while blood-drenched wagers and drunken laughter filled the air, where life was a currency and pain was sport. And now, Hugo, the same dog who had escaped that hell to become a hero, was dragged back, not to fight, but to be used, threatened, like his past had never truly let him go. Another message came. This time, a video. The sender didn't speak but panned the camera around the empty arena. The bleachers still bore dried blood. The rusted wire mesh cages groaned with memory. The camera stops in front of Hugo. The frame shook as the person filming leaned down, then whispered with a voice flat, toneless, cold, "If you want to save him, you know what to do. No cops, no radio, just you, and us." In the video, Hugo didn't bark, didn't growl, but his eyes locked on the camera, as if he knew Sarah was on the other side, as if, somehow, he was holding her there with silent belief. "Don't be afraid. I've survived this place before, but this time, I need you." Sarah felt her chest seize, not with fear, but memory. That spring day when she first met Hugo at the rescue center after he was pulled from a raid on a fighting ring. He had been covered in blood, broken, and shut down. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't look at anyone, until she sat beside him for hours, saying nothing, just like now. They had found each other in that silence, and now she understood. These people didn't just want to hurt Hugo. They wanted to drown him in his old trauma, to shatter the one thing they had built back together, trust in the light. The sender didn't need to show their face. Sarah already knew. The filming style. The way Hugo was chained. The location. A pit they had once failed to shut down. She pieced it together. The ringleader of one of the Southeast's most violent underground dogfighting syndicates. A ghost from a failed raid. Gone without a trace, leaving behind fake IDs, wiped files, and victims never named. He had been watching Hugo for a long time. Maybe he had been watching her, too. Sarah clenched her fists. Her fear was gone. What burned now was resolve, slow and steady like embers beneath ash. She removed her badge and tucked it into her inner pocket, took off her radio, checked the clip in her gun. Not to attack, but to remind herself. If this goes to the edge, she will fight. Not for rules, not for duty, not for titles, but for Hugo, for the eyes that still searched for her through the camera, for every scar he bore, for what he had given up just to live as a protector. She drew a deep breath, stood tall in the dark corridor, and walked toward the metal door that had creaked open at the end of the hallway, its hinges shrieking like the laughter of the past. And beyond that door, Hugo was waiting. Not to be rescued, but to be held again, not by just anyone, but by the only person who had ever believed in him when the world had given up. The heavy metal door shut behind Sarah with a clang that echoed through the suffocating space. The faint yellow light smeared across concrete walls, stained with moss and old blood, flickered weakly. The stench of rust and mold clung to everything as if this place had been sealed away by time and pain, and was only now being forced to relive itself for one final nightmare. And as Sarah's steps touched the icy cement, memories rushed back with brutal clarity. A rainy spring afternoon, years ago, the first time she laid eyes on Hugo. The beginning, the moment a dog the world had labeled unfixable chose to trust her. And since that day, they had taught each other how to survive, how to fight, how to care. She had just completed her advanced K9 training, bright-eyed, determined, eager to choose her partner for a new unit. The department offered her the perfect candidates, purebreds, obedient, well-documented, ready to perform. But no matter how many profiles she reviewed, no matter how many tails wagged eagerly at her, something inside her kept waiting, searching, for something deeper than training records, for something scarred, something raw, something real. That search led her to the final row of the rescue center, the place no one wanted visitors to see. The unmanageable dogs, the ones who had attacked, been abused, locked away so long they had forgotten what it meant to live with people. Each cage was a sentence, each stairs a flickering, dying hope. And at the very end, in a cage corroded with rust, she saw him. Hugo. He was gaunt, ribs jutting out beneath a coat matted with old wounds. One leg limped, a scar trailed from his neck to his chest, and his eyes were hollow, like he had nothing left to lose. He didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't wag, just looked up slowly, quietly, and locked eyes with her, not asking for rescue, not begging for kindness, but daring her. Will you turn away like everyone else? The supervisor, an older man with a weary face and resigned voice, stood behind her and muttered, "Don't waste your time. Belgian Malinois, picked up in the Georgia raids, ex-fighter, trained to kill, been locked up 2 years, 2 failed rehab attempts. He's scheduled to be put down tomorrow." Sarah didn't answer. She just sat. No hand outstretched, no words, just presence. And Hugo, slowly, as if weighing his entire life in that one motion, stood, walked to the front of the cage, Saturday, and lowered his scarred head to the floor. No expression, no hope, just acceptance. "If you want to try, I'm still here." That nod changed everything. She signed the transfer papers that same day. Everyone warned her. An unstable dog, dangerous history, possible liability. But Sarah didn't see a broken fighter. She saw a soul that had never known gentleness. A creature who had never been taught that existence didn't have to mean violence. And so she brought Hugo home, not as a tool, but as a friend, a partner, someone she would fight the whole world to protect. The early months were hell. He panicked at night, growled at thunder, tore up carpets at the sound of sirens, like each sound dragged him back into the pit he had barely crawled out of. But Sarah never raised her voice, never gave him commands. She gave him time, nights on the floor beside him, a gentle hand on his back during nightmares, eyes that never looked away when he trembled with memory. And over time, Hugo changed. He learned to sleep by her bed, to trust a soft voice, to slow his steps and match hers, because the woman who chose him when no one else would had stayed. And now, as Sarah once again stepped into hell, where Hugo was chained, just as he had been in another life, where monsters tried to weaponize memory, she knew this wasn't just a rescue. It was redemption, a promise closing its loop, that if Hugo had once found his way back to himself, she would never, ever let anyone take that away again. And then, from the end of the hallway, came a soft, scratching sound. A sound so familiar it made Sarah's chest tighten. It was Hugo. No barking, no whimpering, just the gentle scrape of his claws against the concrete. The signal he used to give her long ago. Not fear. Just waiting. Sarah clenched her fists and quickened her pace, her heartbeat matching each step. Because this time she wasn't here to try saving a broken dog. She was here to keep a promise to the one friend who had always believed in her, even when she wasn't sure she still believed in herself. The soft scraping of claws came again, like a whisper threading through the dark. And as Sarah stepped through the final door of the narrow corridor, her chest tightened at the sight before her. Hugo stood alone in the center of a cracked concrete ring, harsh halogen lights beating down from above, casting long, distorted shadows that circled him like the ghosts of his past. A thick metal chain wound around his neck, tethered to a steel post driven into the floor, limiting his movements to only a few feet. Just enough to fight, but not to run. His face was smeared with dust. One ear bore a fresh tear, but his eyes, steady, unwavering, held no fear, no rage, only the quiet resolve of a soul who had survived, and who now refused to become the monster his past demanded. From the stands, where the shadows hung like velvet drapes, a voice emerged, deep, cruel, unmistakably familiar. It was him, the nameless man, the ghost they'd hunted and lost, the puppeteer of a trafficking ring that dealt in both human and animal life. And now, the one gripping Hugo's fate like a toy, waiting for its string to be pulled. He leaned against the rusted railing, mic in hand, his voice echoing through the arena like a lullaby soaked in blood. "Welcome home, Hugo. Do you remember this place? You once killed 3 dogs here in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. And tonight you'll get your shot again, but this time against something that doesn't feel pain, doesn't fear, doesn't forgive." The opposite cage screeched open. From the darkness emerged a creature that sent a chill straight down Sarah's spine, a genetically altered mutt, its body grotesquely larger than natural, patches of fur shaved for embedded tech, reflective visors over its eyes, reinforced limbs encased in clawed armor. Every step it took clicked like a machine designed for one purpose: destruction. Sarah instinctively moved, but a blade pressed to her neck stopped her cold. A cold hand gripped her shoulder. His voice again, this time just behind her ear. "Easy, Officer Collins. You want to save your dog? Then let him show you what he is, a warrior or just a medal-wearing ghost." Below, Hugo slipped one paw from the chain, watching the monster before him not with the eyes of a fighter, but as if he were trying to understand how life had once again been twisted into blood sport. The beast snarled, its glowing eyes flashed, and it launched forward, blindingly fast. The impact shook the pit. Hugo dodged, pivoted, slid across the cement, and rose like a dancer forged in war. A second lunge. Faster. Fiercer. Hugo ducked again, old reflexes kicking in, but instead of snapping his teeth around the opponent's throat, a move drilled into him. He slammed his shoulder into its chest, toppling it sideways. The cheers from the stands, the bloodthirsty roar Sarah had heard too many times in dogfighting footage, faltered. Hugo didn't attack. He stood still. His eyes followed the engineered beast as it struggled to its feet, then turned to the stands, where he stood, where the ones who had once forced Hugo to kill to survive were now waiting for him to betray everything he had learned with Sarah. And then, Hugo did what no one expected. He stepped back, slowly, one deliberate step at a time, head raised, his gaze locked onto the shadows where Sarah was still being held, as if to say, "I choose not to kill, not because I'm weak, but because I remember who I am." The entire arena fell silent. No one spoke, not out of shock, but because they had been exposed. All the programs, the training, the weapons, the state-of-the-art tech, none of it could overpower one thing: choice. Hugo, once a dog caged in steel, once forced to bite to survive, had now learned how to live without biting. And in that moment, he wasn't a wounded fighter anymore. He was a hero. Sarah didn't cry, but her throat closed up. And when Hugo turned his head to look at her through the barrier, his eyes were steady, calm. And in that gaze, she knew, despite everything, he was still there. Not broken, not bent. And though the arena may have been rebuilt, Hugo had not. He no longer belonged to this place. He had made his choice. Now it was her turn to decide what she would do to bring him out of it one last time. In the suffocating silence that gripped the stands after Hugo's unthinkable act, Sarah felt the hand gripping her shoulder loosen, just a flicker of distraction. But for her, even a second was a lifeline. With instincts honed from years on the edge between life and death, she twisted, slammed her elbow into her captor's ribs, snatched the knife as it fell from his hand, and bolted toward the arena. Just as the crowd erupted in confused chaos, realizing their blood-soaked spectacle had been shattered by the one force they couldn't predict: loyalty. Hugo stood firm in the center of the ring, lifting his head as Sarah charged toward him. For a brief instant, his eyes glowed with that familiar light, not of a fighter's reflex, but of something warmer. The same look he gave her the day they first met in the rescue shelter, when she knelt outside his cage. And he chose, against every survival instinct, to trust a stranger. No command. No call. Hugo surged forward. The chain stretched taut, then snapped free as Sarah yanked the release latch beneath the concrete base. No one running this place had imagined that a dog like Hugo would refuse to fight hard enough to break the arena itself. As Sarah drew her weapon and disarmed a guard near the backstage exit, she and Hugo slipped into the maze of corridors behind the arena. Emergency lights flared red. Sirens howled from above as the mercenaries realized their prize was slipping away. But Sarah didn't stop. She gripped Hugo, now limping from the earlier impact, and helped him press forward, deeper into the operations hub, hidden behind a thick electronic security door. Inside, dozens of screens lit up with maps, GPS grids, and live surveillance feeds of human holding facilities. The servers ran encrypted files in endless loops, all evidence of a tightly run, militarized organization shielded by tech that no civilian investigation unit could ever breach. Hugo stopped at a metal cabinet in the corner, nose twitching as he sniffed the lower seam. Sarah understood immediately. She yanked the panel from behind the unit, revealing a hidden compartment housing a hardened drive. Waterproof, magnet-proof, the kind used in high-level espionage operations. Without hesitation, she pulled it free, shoved it into a specialized backpack, and plugged a spoofing device into the mainframe. Within minutes, it would send a false signal, making it appear the drive was still in place. In that moment, the screen's glow reflected in Hugo's eyes as he watched her. In his gaze, she saw more than a soldier's focus. She saw intuition, worry, and something deeper curling inside him, as if Hugo, too, knew what they were seeing was only the surface of something vast and buried. Footsteps echoed down the hall, heavier, more disciplined. Not guards, a rapid response unit. Sarah signaled to Hugo. The two of them crawled through the rear escape panel, following a maintenance tunnel that led to an exterior hatch. Rain from the season's first storm pelted down as they popped the cover and slipped behind a brick wall, where their old K9 unit truck waited a few hundred meters away. Sarah fired up the engine, lungs burning. Hugo leapt into the back seat, still scanning the dark behind them like the story wasn't over yet. On the road back, as the rain streaked long, ghostly trails across the windshield, Sarah booted up her laptop and connected the drive. Files began to unfold. Slowly at first. Lines of code unraveled into a digital map. Hundreds of red dots blinked across a map of the United States. Each dot, a holding site, a transport point, a data vault. She knew immediately. What they'd just escaped was only one branch, a single node in a federal-scale network built by people who not only knew how to hide from the law, but had protection from places too high to name. Hugo curled into her lap as she pulled off the road into a quiet forest clearing. Her hand ran gently over his head, feeling the warmth that was still miraculously there. She whispered, not to herself, but to him, the only soul she knew would never betray her. We're not done. This is just the beginning. And Hugo, as lightning flashed beyond the windshield, closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but to hold on to what they'd reclaimed. Once again, from the hands of the dark. The next morning, before the first rays of sunlight could chase away the dampness left by the previous night's rain, Sarah brought Hugo back to the temporary headquarters of the Federal Task Force. Inside, the contents of the recovered hard drive were being decrypted piece by piece by a team of elite cybersecurity technicians. Hugo was still limping, the wound on his left shoulder carefully bandaged, but he didn't look tired. On the contrary, his gaze was unnervingly alert, his movements quiet but taut, as if his instincts were warning him that this place, though seemingly secure, was hiding something out of sync, something that didn't feel right. Sarah felt it too, though she couldn't name it yet. The data room was under heavy guard. The servers were gradually revealing encrypted files from the drive. Each minute that passed uncovered another puzzle piece. Names, financial routes, and internal documents that appeared linked to multiple government agencies. It was all too smooth, too structured. What unsettled her most wasn't the sophistication. It was the fact that this entire network had operated in the dark for years without being detected. As Agent Diana Chen, liaison between the FBI and the K9 unit, stepped into the room, her face as cold and composed as ever, Hugo reacted instantly. Not with a growl or aggression, but with a single sharp bark, clear, precise, and unmistakably a warning, as if he smelled something off, something that didn't match the rest of the room. Chen froze for a split second. Her eyes flicked to Hugo, perhaps ready to dismiss his reaction as stress or injury. Then, calmly, she bent down to pat him. But Hugo stepped back, barked again, his gaze locked on the shoulder of her blazer, right where tactical communication devices were often hidden. Sarah's heart skipped. Hugo had never reacted like this to Chen in previous briefings, and this didn't feel like pain. It felt like an alert. She stayed silent and followed his gaze. This time he wasn't looking at Chen anymore. He was staring at a steel filing cabinet in the corner of the room. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Sarah walked over slowly and opened the bottom drawer. Empty. But Hugo lowered his head and let out a soft growl, nose pressed against the narrow gap between the cabinet and the wall behind it. Sarah crouched, reached into the crevice, and felt something small, palm-sized, wrapped in moisture-proof plastic. A tiny directional mic. Hidden recording equipment. The kind you couldn't buy off the shelf, only through military-grade contractors. The room froze. Chen took a step forward, her lips pressed tight. Her gaze sharpened to something cold and calculated. Not the look of someone caught off guard, but of someone exposed, someone evaluating whether to retreat or strike first. Sarah spoke, her voice low and clear, each word weighted. "This isn't FBI issue, and it's not on the approved surveillance list." Chen didn't answer. A beat of silence. Then she tilted her head slightly, her gray eyes locking onto Sarah's, no longer those of a colleague, but of someone calculating her next move. But Hugo responded first, this time with a low, rumbling growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through his whole frame. It wasn't aggression. It was instinct, a warning beyond logic, a primal sense that they were being watched, betrayed, trapped. Chen turned away. Her voice, when it came, was flat and final. "I'll report this. But if you're wrong, Collins, there won't be a second chance." The door slammed behind her, her heels clicking down the hallway like a countdown ticking toward collapse. Sarah stood frozen, fingers clenched around the cold little mic. Her eyes found Hugo, who had once again pulled her out of a lie wrapped in the skin of trust. And in that moment, the truth hit with chilling clarity. The FBI, or at least part of it, had been compromised. And if Chen was the mole, then what they had uncovered from the drive wasn't just information. It was a direct blow to a power structure that had operated undisturbed for years. Hugo stepped forward, nuzzling his head into Sarah's hand. She bent down and rested her palm on his scarred head, not to thank him, but to steady them both. "You were right again. But we're not backing down, not this time." And Hugo didn't bark, didn't growl. He just stood beside her, silent and still, as if he understood. The real fight was only just beginning. Just hours after Hugo had exposed the chilling deceit beneath Agent Chen's polished cooperation, Sarah hadn't even filed the official report on the listening device when an urgent call cut through the tense quiet of the command room. A suspicious gray truck had been flagged, leaving a warehouse, one marked as a red zone from the hard drive she and Hugo had recovered. Traffic cameras and GPS triangulation confirmed. The vehicle was speeding down Interstate 20, heading straight into downtown Atlanta. Initial intel was grim. 2 children, a boy and a girl around 7 to 9 years old, were believed to be inside. Both had been taken from an orphanage that had closed for financial reasons less than a week ago. A detail that made Sarah's heart drop straight into her stomach. Without hesitation, she jumped into the task force SUV, Hugo at her side. Silent, steady, a shadow in motion. His front leg was still wrapped, but his gaze was unwavering. Not a flicker of doubt in his eyes as the car peeled out of the lot and tore onto the rain-slicked highway. The radio crackled with static and dispatch directives, but Sarah barely registered them. Her mind was locked on 2 images, the fear in the children's eyes, and Hugo, her partner, who knew too well what it meant to be caged, silenced, and treated like cargo. The pursuit unfolded with white-knuckle intensity. Despite police blockades at 3 exits, the truck didn't stop. Instead, it accelerated, darting through rush-hour traffic with the erratic velocity of someone who had no intention of pulling over or surviving. Sarah surged ahead, overtaking 2 patrol units, trying to flank the vehicle on the left. Suddenly, Hugo moved. He shifted towards the passenger window, tense, poised, ready for something only a warrior who'd danced at death's edge would dare attempt. "Hugo, no," Sarah muttered, but deep down she knew. Once Hugo had chosen, no one, not even her, could stop him. When the distance closed to just a few meters, Hugo launched. He leapt through the open window, slicing through the wind like a black arrow, sunlight flashing off the windshield of the fleeing truck. A scream erupted from the driver as Hugo landed on the hood, claws screeching across metal, his body anchoring to the frame like a living iron weight. The truck swerved wildly, veering right, rear wheels skidding sideways as the driver jerked the wheel in panic, trying to shake the creature clinging to his windshield. But Hugo held fast. Sarah saw it all unfold in a matter of breathless seconds. The truck clipped the curb hard. slammed into the steel guardrail, lifted off the ground, spun 3 times, and crashed onto its side. Smoke poured from the crushed hood, curling upward like a grim warning. This was the price of reckless desperation. She slammed on the brakes. Before the smoke could fully spread, she jumped out of the SUV and sprinted toward the wreckage. Her heart pounded as her eyes frantically searched the twisted metal for any sign of Hugo. He wasn't there. Then, a low, broken sound. A strained whimper, muffled but unmistakable. It came from beneath the detached passenger door. Sarah darted toward the noise, dust swirling around her boots. And there, dragging himself out from the debris, was Hugo. His back torn, one leg bent awkwardly, but his eyes were still sharp, still on her, still alive. Relief surged through her, but there was no time to pause. She lunged toward the back of the truck and flung open the rear doors. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. 2 children, one blonde girl, one curly-haired boy. Hands bound, mouths sealed with duct tape. Their eyes are wide with terror and confusion, but they were breathing, still alive. The moment they saw Sarah and Hugo, the little girl broke into sobs. Sarah quickly freed them. She knelt, gently guided the girl's shaking hand to Hugo's back. And in that moment, Hugo lowered his head and softly licked the swollen wrist, raw from the restraints, as if telling her in the only language he had, "You're safe now." Sarah looked up, and her vision blurred, not from the smoke, but from the wave of emotion swelling in her chest. Hugo hadn't hesitated. Not for a second. He hadn't acted on command. He hadn't followed training. He'd leapt because he knew what it meant to be trapped, to be voiceless, to wait for someone who might never come. He had chosen to save them, because no one else might have, because Hugo understood, better than anyone, the difference between being alive and simply surviving. And Sarah knew, without a shred of doubt, that the people behind this, the ones orchestrating the system from behind sealed doors, had just received their first warning. The game was changing, because the dog they once called beyond saving had become the one thing they could never stop. When the children were safely loaded into the ambulance and Hugo received temporary emergency treatment on site from a veterinarian, Sarah stood still for a moment, her hand resting gently on his head. A silent message he had always understood. Without Hugo, the ending would have been very different. But even in that brief moment of relief, a familiar instinct stirred inside her. Peace never lasted long, especially when the darkness they were fighting kept returning, each time wearing a new mask. And this time, it had returned with a name Sarah could never forget. Emily Torres. Emily, the young woman Sarah and Hugo had rescued not long ago from the trunk of a car, had now stepped from the shadows of victimhood into the harsh light of being a key witness. She carried inside her pieces of information the criminal network was desperately trying to erase. After days of medical care and recovery, Emily began cooperating with the agents, her voice still shaky, but her eyes steadier than before. Hand-drawn maps, hastily written codes remembered from her forced transfers allowed the investigation team to identify at least 5 new potential human trafficking sites. But that knowledge came at a price. Emily was no longer just a survivor. She was the key, the living evidence, and because of that, an unavoidable target. Sarah decided to move Emily to a safer location in the city, a secure shelter disguised as a mental health facility for special witnesses. But from the moment they left headquarters, Hugo began acting differently. He walked lower to the ground, nose lifted constantly as if tracking something unfamiliar in the air. More than once, he came to a sudden stop, forcing Sarah to slam on the brakes. At first she thought it was the pain from his injury, but the intensity in his eyes, fixed on something high above where the maze of concrete buildings stood close together, told her his instincts had picked up something no surveillance device ever could. They had just reached the parking lot behind the shelter when Hugo suddenly let out a deep, guttural growl, low and sharp, the kind of sound that only came before danger struck. Sarah turned to ask what was wrong, but everything froze. A thunderous metallic crack echoed. Sniper fire whistled past, striking the wall inches from Emily. The young woman collapsed, pale and confused, before Hugo leapt forward, using his body to shield her completely, eyes scanning the rooftops in quick, sharp movements. Sarah drew her weapon, pressed against the wall, scanning every ledge, her pulse pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. This wasn't an accident. This was a hit. Someone had found out Emily was talking and they weren't going to let her finish. But what they hadn't accounted for was Hugo. He didn't just protect her. He moved slowly and deliberately, tracking the scent, until he suddenly snapped his head around, let out a short bark, yanked Emily's jacket, and forced her under the car just as another burst of gunfire tore through the air, slamming into the metal just inches above her. Sarah traced the bullet's path, and, with Hugo's signal, identified the sniper's position. 8th floor, opposite building, right side, small window slightly ajar where a glint of sunlight had just reflected off a scope. She didn't hesitate, called for reinforcements, dispatched a tactical team to approach, while she stayed, guarding Emily and Hugo, who, despite his injuries, refused to move. It was as if he knew. Even the slightest shift from him could mean the end for the girl under his protection. The sniper was eventually captured. A contract killer with no ID, no biometric trace, no name, just a coded mission stored on a secure device. Neutralize target ET. Top priority. Payment upon confirmed death. He said nothing as they cuffed him. He turned his face when he saw Hugo, a final confirmation that this wasn't random violence. It was part of a system, one far more ruthless and wide-reaching than they had imagined. Emily, still trembling, looked at Hugo through tear-filled eyes. Not from fear, but from something deeper. For the first time in the long nightmare of her captivity, someone had risked everything for her, not out of duty, not for reward, but out of choice. Sarah knelt beside Hugo, her hand resting gently over a still-healing wound. Their eyes met, and in that quiet moment, they both knew. This had become more than a case. It was a battle for truth, and Hugo, the dog once deemed unfit, disposable, was now the weapon the darkness never saw coming. From this moment forward, Emily would no longer be a victim. She had survived, she had spoken, and now, with Hugo by her side, she would become the torchlight cutting through the deepest corners of the dark, where power still tried to hide. With Emily secured inside the protected facility, 2 undercover agents rotating shifts at her door, and Hugo ever watchful like a silent guardian, Sarah finally had time to sit down with Rodriguez. He was her longtime partner, the only person left she could truly trust in a world splintered by masks and tangled schemes. They sat in the temporary operations room, yellow light from the ceiling casting long shadows over messy stacks of documents and blinking monitors showing maps, financial charts, and decoded data, all sourced from the hard drive Hugo had nearly died retrieving. After hours of following encrypted transactions layered through dozens of shell accounts, Rodriguez finally uncovered a single repeating money trail, not flashy but consistent, flowing from a shell company called Northcrest Holdings to various warehouses, detention centers, and private security firms previously linked to disappearances. At first, the name Northcrest seemed insignificant, until they cross-checked it against federal contract databases. That's when everything stopped. Northcrest Holdings wasn't just another front. It was a top-tier financial partner on 3 different federal programs: a juvenile rehabilitation project, an immigration detention center construction bid, and, most shockingly, a classified contract with the Pentagon for enhanced border security. Sarah couldn't believe what she was reading. The contract details were legitimate. Every line, every signature, even a federal office's seal from Washington. It was all perfectly legal, so clean it was untouchable. But Sarah had been in the game too long. When something is protected this carefully, it's not just about national security. It's about hiding a network no one wants exposed. Rodriguez remained quiet, his eyes darkening as he flipped through the final folder. Sealed in red, delivered anonymously just 2 days earlier, coinciding almost too conveniently with the sniper attack. Inside was a corporate structure chart of Northcrest Holdings, with branching arrows pointing to dozens of subsidiaries across the southeastern states. But what truly took their breath away was at the bottom. The name of the group's primary sponsor, hidden behind 2 offshore investment funds and a web of international shell companies. It belonged to a man carrying the title, Special Strategic Advisor to the Senate Intelligence Committee. Sarah dropped her pen, leaning back, eyes drifting toward the window where Hugo still stood guard, early afternoon sunlight catching the edge of his dusty coat and the fading wounds across his side. She knew what they had still wasn't enough. This wasn't just a case. It was a puzzle stretching far beyond anything she'd worked on before. Every time they lifted one corner of the curtain, a new layer of power and deceit was waiting underneath. What Emily had given them was real. The money trail was real. The locations were real. But they were still missing the one thing that could bring it all into the light. A piece of evidence no one could deny. Rodriguez shook his head, voice low but certain. We have everything. Except the last piece, a confession or an unencrypted internal document. Sarah nodded slowly, her fingers resting on the file like she was holding the only thing keeping them from being swallowed by a sea of danger and disinformation. Hugo stepped closer, resting his head on her leg like always, awaiting the next command. At that moment, Sarah thought, if the man behind this entire network knew that the very creature once marked as beyond rehabilitation was the one prying open his empire, he wouldn't be sleeping easy anymore. This wasn't just about dismantling a criminal ring, it was about exposing a machine fueled by blood, money, and silence. A system that Sarah, Hugo, and Rodriguez understood too well. Without that final, undeniable proof, it would remain out of reach. But they also knew one thing for sure. Those in power who believe they're untouchable often forget the cost of their confidence. And that confidence would be their downfall. In the tense days following the meeting with Rodriguez and the shocking discovery of the financial force behind the human trafficking network, Sarah poured every ounce of herself into finding the final piece of evidence. Her eyes were darkened from sleepless nights, her mind blurred by maps and classified documents. But amidst all the chaos, there was one thing she couldn't bring herself to say out loud. Hugo was changing. At first it was subtle, his steps heavier than usual, as if he were simply tired after a long chase. But Sarah knew him too well. Hugo had never shown fatigue, not even after the most brutal missions. Slowly, the signs grew more worrying. He slept more. His eyes seemed unfocused when he woke. His reactions slowed by just a beat. And the moment that truly broke her heart was when he whimpered quietly as he tried to rise after a night guarding the door, like every muscle in his body was rebelling against him, inch by inch. Unable to wait any longer, Sarah took Hugo to the veterinarian who had cared for him throughout their time working together. The sterile white room fell into an unbearable silence when the blood test results were laid on the table. The old doctor, who had seen Hugo recover from battles that would have ended most dogs, who had always believed nothing could bring him down, bowed his head for a long time before meeting Sarah's eyes. He didn't need to speak. She already understood. It was poison, a rare, slow-acting neurotoxin that targeted the nervous system, eroding reflexes and weakening motor function as if the body were unraveling itself from within. And the source? Hidden in the lining of the very protective vest Hugo wore on every mission. Embedded beneath the synthetic fabric was a thin metallic layer, undetectable unless the entire vest was dissected. Someone had planned this long ago. They knew Hugo's routines, his gear, and had chosen the perfect moment to strike in the cruelest way possible. Silently, gradually, without a trace until it was almost too late. Sarah was numb. She sat beside Hugo in the medical room, her trembling hand resting on his back as he tried to lift his head, his eyes still bright, still locked on her like always, no fear, no blame, just the gentle, familiar gaze that had spoken for years when words had failed her. His breath came slower now, his heartbeat skipping faintly under the doctor's touch. But even with a weakening pulse, he struggled to stand when he saw Sarah cry, as if trying to tell her he was still here, still fighting, and he wouldn't leave her easily. "It can't end like this," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking not like a prayer to any god, but like a plea to Hugo, to the soul of the friend who had stood with her through every descent into darkness. She thought of the countless lives Hugo had saved, the way he had licked the bound hands of rescued children, how he had led her to places no police dog or technology ever could, how he had stepped in front of a loaded gun for her without hesitation. And now, an invisible trap was killing him from within, not because he was weak, but because someone out there feared him, feared the silent strength, feared the loyalty that couldn't be bought, feared the heart of a dog who had never once asked for anything in return. Hugo lifted his head again, his nose brushing gently against Sarah's palm, a light, wordless touch that said everything. He hadn't given up. Somewhere inside, a part of him was still resisting the poison clawing at his nerves. And he would go on, not out of duty, but for her. And in that moment, Sarah knew they still had time. Not much, and not for long, but enough to fight. She stood, wiped her tears, her eyes sharpening like a blade being drawn from its sheath. Someone had tried to kill Hugo quietly. That person would not stay hidden for long, because if Hugo had chosen to survive, she would choose to fight, for him and justice, the only way they had always known. Side by side, even at the very edge of life and death. Only a day after learning Hugo had been poisoned by a rare neurotoxin embedded in his protective vest, a discovery that nearly brought Sarah to her knees in silent grief, but also ignited a fire inside her fiercer than anything before. She and Rodriguez devised a plan to breach the internal data center of Northcrest Holdings. It was the corporate heart where all financial trails led, and they believed the final proof, a decrypted file naming those behind the operation, was stored in its high-security basement vault. With no legal warrant, and unable to trust anyone within the FBI, Sarah chose to go in alone. It was reckless, off-protocol, and dangerous. But she knew Hugo's time was slipping away, and they could no longer afford to lose anyone else. She left Hugo outside, attaching a chest camera and a tracking earpiece to herself. She ran her hand gently along his back, whispering through a tight throat, "Wait here, just for a moment. I'll be back." Hugo didn't bark, didn't nod. He simply looked at her, a gaze carved into her mind, ears lowered slightly, the anxiety in his eyes impossible to miss. Sarah knew. If anyone could sense danger before it showed itself, it was Hugo, but she walked away anyway, because she had to for him. She entered through a service corridor, following an old schematic from a former employee. With forged clearance badges and a signal jammer provided by Rodriguez, she maneuvered past the layers of security and finally reached the sub-level. An ice-cold steel room filled with servers humming like the artificial heartbeat of an empire. She began copying data, eyes locked on the screen as lines of code unfolded, files containing names, photos, and transaction histories. But just then, the signal cut. All external connections went dead. The chest camera blinked off. Her tracking signal flickered, then disappeared entirely from the outside monitor, where Hugo still waited, eyes locked on the barely ajar iron door, ears up like living antennae. For a moment, he stayed still. But then, a faint alarm rang through the vents. The sharp scent of explosives and fresh blood drifted through the crack. Hugo didn't wait for orders. He charged. The steel door couldn't withstand his force. He slammed into it like a living bullet, teeth tearing at the frame, claws scraping against the tile until the latch snapped open. Red lights from the alarm flashed like a dying heartbeat. When he reached her, Sarah was pinned to the wall by a man in a fake security uniform, his hand crushing her throat while the other armed a device, a timed explosive, already ticking, enough to reduce the entire data room to ashes. Without thinking, without hesitating, Hugo charged. His leap sent the attacker stumbling, his back slamming hard against the steel wall, the gun flying from his hand. Sarah collapsed, coughing violently, but forced herself up, eyes locked on Hugo, now pinning the man down with every ounce of strength, his fangs sunk deep into the attacker's arm, blood spraying like red ink across the pages of a secret file. But then came the sound. Beep. Slow, eerie, chilling. The timer had started. 10 seconds. Hugo released the guard and bolted toward the explosive device. Sarah tried to scream, to call him back, but he didn't stop. It was as if he knew only he could do this. Relying on pure instinct, he bit down hard on the detonation wire, yanked it back with enough force to sever the main circuit. His tongue bled from the electrical shock that struck back, but the countdown stopped. The screen flickered, then went black in silence. The room was left with nothing but the sound of ragged breathing and the steady hum of data still transferring on the screen. The final line blinked into view like a living testament. File 43. Internal Agreement, Federal Government, and Northcrest Holdings. Sarah dropped to her knees beside Hugo, her hands trembling as she touched his muzzle, now tinged with a faint purple from the current. But his eyes were still open, still watching her. His tail gave a faint wag, as if to say one thing, simple but more powerful than any thank you. I'm still here. And she knew, even as the poison slowly stole away his reflexes, even as the enemy remained hidden in the dark. Hugo wouldn't stop. Not as long as Sarah still needed him. Not as long as the shadows continued to hide children whose names hadn't yet been spoken. He was a warrior who had chosen the light. And she, the one who carried the torch, would never let him fight alone. When the last alarm fell silent in the Northcrest data center and Rodriguez's rapid response team burst through the doors, they found Sarah on the floor, holding Hugo in her arms, not just to keep him upright, but to check every injury after the brutal electrical shock. Hugo's body trembled faintly, his breathing still unstable, but his eyes remained open, steady, full of that same unwavering resolve. We're not done yet. Emergency medics quickly took him to an ambulance. Sarah, clutching the hard drive that now contained decrypted classified files, felt a rush of urgency mixed with exhaustion. She knew, if anyone tampered with or erased the data before it reached the prosecutors, their only shot at exposing the true puppet master behind everything would vanish. Back at the safe house, Sarah barely took her eyes off Hugo. As the vet administered fluids and placed him into a deep recovery state, she gently removed his armored vest, the very gear that had accompanied him through countless operations, but also the same place where poison had been planted, colorless, odorless, and hidden in the inner lining. She inspected every seam, not out of suspicion, but driven by a strange intuition, because despite being poisoned, captured, and cut off from all signals, Hugo had survived. He had shown up at the exact moment he was needed, fought with precision, almost as if he had known all along. What had kept him going? What had kept him one step ahead? And then, she found something tucked beneath the left shoulder padding, where Hugo had once been cut during the underground fight ring raid. It was a tiny chip, nestled against the protective wiring. It wasn't part of any standard K9 unit design. Sarah extracted it carefully with a precision tool and plugged it into her laptop. What appeared on the screen stunned her like another electric jolt. A system log message. Autosync active. Regional data traffic captured. 96 gigabytes over 4 days. She froze, eyes locked on the lines of code flashing across the interface. The entire time, Hugo had been held inside the trafficker's command center, from the moment he was dragged into the ring until Sarah stormed in. The backup chip inside his armor had been silently recording and syncing all surrounding data traffic. Internal transmissions, network schematics, remote server access logs, even audio from secret meetings held upstairs. Meetings where men in suits and nameless ID badges ran what they casually referred to as asset processing. Sarah looked at Hugo, now asleep, his breaths soft and slow in the dim room, and her throat tightened. He hadn't just survived. He hadn't just fought. He had gathered evidence in complete silence when no one, not even she, had thought it possible to retrieve anything from the core servers. Hugo had launched a counterstrike, not with teeth, but with presence. By being seen as just a dog, as harmless, he'd slipped into the heart of the enemy's operation and brought back the missing piece they needed. When Rodriguez burst into the room, helmet still on, Sarah simply pointed at the screen. There it was. Northcrest Holdings' internal network map lighting up, showing branches across 5 states, victim transport routes, coded project names, and a financial report labeled in bold red. Top secret, human asset redistribution, priority completion 72 hours. She whispered, voice caught in her chest. Hugo kept everything. We have it, Rodriguez. Finally, we have everything. Rodriguez said nothing. His eyes burned. Not just with the weight of the discovery, but with something more. The belief Hugo had restored in a moment when everything seemed on the verge of collapse. And in that room, where a defiant woman and a dog once sentenced by his past sat side by side, the final counterstrike was already underway. Not with weapons, but with loyalty, sacrifice, and an intelligence no system ever accounted for. Not from a machine, but from a dog once dismissed as nothing more than muscle and bark, who turned out to be the gatekeeper to the truth. Just hours after extracting the backup chip from Hugo's vest, the data had already been routed through internal analytics systems. While Rodriguez assembled a legal team to prepare the indictment files, Sarah remained by Hugo's bedside, her hand still gently holding his front paw, where his pulse beat faintly, steadily, like a quiet echo reminding her that he was still fighting. But just as they began to believe they finally held all the pieces, one audio snippet, extracted by AI from the raw network logs Hugo had recorded, brought the entire room to a standstill. It was a conversation, less than 3 minutes long, buried in an encrypted signal from the top floor of the data center, a level Sarah had never reached during her infiltration. The first voice, female, deep and cold, held absolute confidence. No trace of doubt. We need a scapegoat. She's gone too far, and the dog, if it's still alive, will become a symbol. Symbols must be controlled or destroyed, a man replied, his tone weary but laced with unmistakable power. Can you handle it? The media won't be easy. The woman chuckled, a sound that sent chills racing down Sarah's spine. I'm a federal agent, Phillips. I was trained to make people believe what they need to believe. A dog from an illegal ring? A rogue officer? Easier than you think. The final name hit Sarah like a blade to the heart. Phillips, the Attorney General. The man who, for months, had stood before cameras vowing to eradicate federal crime at its root. The same man who had once placed his hand on Sarah's shoulder during her first commendation ceremony with Hugo. Now he was conspiring with Agent Diana Chen, the very woman Hugo had once barked at in warning, constructing a false narrative to paint them as traitors, as liabilities, all to protect a system already rotting from the inside. Rodriguez stood frozen, the vein at his temple twitching under tension. Sarah didn't speak. Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen, where the audio waves played out in clear pulses like the artificial heartbeats of two people who never imagined they'd be overheard, especially not by a dog. She looked down at Hugo, who was awake now, watching her, weak but alert, as if he knew he had just landed the first devastating blow against the polished shell that Chen and Phillips had built to hide their crimes. You saved us again, Sarah whispered, her fingers stroking the curve of his ear, right where the microchip had been hidden. No one had ever paid attention to it, not even her. It was meant to be a precaution against abductions, and yet it had just exposed a conspiracy from the highest floor of power. Hugo didn't need to understand every word, but his eyes said he already knew. No matter what the world called him, canine, tool, asset. He had never been just a piece in the game. He was the witness. He held the final key. Rodriguez turned to her, his voice low but brimming with resolve. "We have everything. The audio, the data, the money, it all matches. But if they move first..." Sarah cut him off. Her eyes were sharp, colder than he'd ever seen them since this all began. "Then we move now, before they paint me as the criminal and turn Hugo into a monster." She knew it wouldn't be easy. Chen and Phillips didn't just hold power, they controlled the narrative. They had media contacts, prepared files, and crafted storylines that could make anyone disappear behind a wall of doubt. But this time, they had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated Hugo. They thought he was just a dog. They didn't know he had become a symbol, not because of medals, but because he walked into darkness and brought the light back out. And Sarah, the only partner Hugo had ever chosen, would carry his voice into the world. A voice built on loyalty, bravery, and truth that couldn't be bent or bought. This wasn't just a counterstrike anymore. This was the reckoning, not in the shadows but under the blinding lights of justice. And this time, Hugo wouldn't bark in silence. He would be heard, he would be believed, and he would be protected. After the secret recording between Chen and Attorney General Phillips was exposed, thanks to the very device Hugo had discreetly planted, Sarah knew their next steps would no longer be safe, not just because their lives were at risk, but because they were now facing a scenario meticulously crafted by those who controlled the media, the law, and the illusion of justice itself. To survive, and to flip the board, they had to do the unthinkable: disappear. And that plan began with something unimaginable: the death of Hugo. The idea hit Sarah like a punch to the chest when Rodriguez first brought it up. But Hugo, as if he understood everything, simply lowered his ears and rested his head in her lap. He didn't resist, didn't whimper, just silently accepted, like he had always done in every battle fought for others. The sacrifice was staged with precision. A decoy police vehicle, fake plates, detonated on the outskirts near the data center, timed perfectly with media reports claiming Sarah had temporarily withdrawn for psychological recovery after a stressful investigation. Inside the car, Hugo carried a biometric tracker and a bag of animal blood to simulate the fatal scene, while Sarah silently watched it all unfold through the hidden rescue unit camera Rodriguez had planted. The news spread like wildfire. K9, Hugo killed in explosion linked to federal human trafficking probe. Agent Sarah Collins' file handed over to the Department of Interior after sudden disappearance. K9 unit under restructuring following major misconduct allegations. Every headline, every article, every broadcast moved exactly as Chen and Phillips had planned, discrediting, burying everything under public emotion, and suffocating curiosity before the truth could escape. But what they didn't expect was that Hugo was still alive. He was breathing, painfully but persistently, hidden in a covert medical facility under Rodriguez's protection. And Sarah, the only one who knew, was ready to infiltrate the final target, the location housing the list of victims and the national trafficking route map. Leveraging rumors of Hugo's death, Sarah used a false identity to approach a logistics hub on the city's western edge, camouflaged as a youth rehabilitation center operated by Northcrest Holdings. No one in the system questioned her. According to internal reports, the greatest threat, Hugo, was gone. She passed through 3 layers of security, the first with forged documents, the second with real pain she had swallowed for days. But her eyes never softened. She walked straight to the steel door-locked data command center, a place only senior staff could access. She carried with her the decryption device recovered from Hugo's chip, and a single whisper in her heart. "Wait for me, Hugo. I'll get everything. For you. For them." The system didn't blink. No alerts, no suspicion. Every access code matched flawlessly, thanks to the data Hugo had backed up while imprisoned. One by one, files opened. Names appeared. Children, women, the elderly, people of every color and background, from rural towns to urban centers, all tagged, categorized, and entered into the system as circulating assets. But there was more: warehouse schematics, trafficking routes, and transit corridors cleared by high-level police orders. A map of hell, now in her hands, with the key to break it. And in that moment, though Hugo wasn't beside her, he was present in every step, every keystroke. His departure had made space for truth to slip through, a sacrifice without gunfire or spilled blood, but a deliberate disappearance to open the path for justice. Sarah knew she now had to return, evidence in hand, ready to strike the final blow. But in her heart, she also knew the price of this sacrifice was too high to let it be forgotten. It had to be heard at any cost. On the way back from the logistics facility, where Sarah had retrieved the list of victims and the complete map of the trafficking network, the Atlanta sky faded into a leaden gray, as if the city itself could sense the storm approaching. Not one born of nature, but of power, cornered and desperate. Her phone buzzed before she even reached the safe zone. The screen lit up with a single unsigned message, no number, no name, just a cold sentence, like a death sentence. Choose Hugo or your mother. Midnight. Riverside facility. Come alone. Sarah sat frozen behind the wheel, eyes wide open but staring at nothing. That familiar feeling returned. The helplessness of being trapped between two impossible lines, like when she chose to adopt Hugo despite every warning, like when she stepped into that data vault knowing she might not come back out. But this time, it wasn't her career, her reputation, or even her life they were threatening. It was her mother, the woman who had raised her alone through countless cold winters, who believed her daughter was doing the right thing, and who now was a pawn in the last game of men who had run out of moves. Sarah didn't cry. She only turned her head to the back seat, where Hugo, just extracted from his hidden safe house by Rodriguez, sat silently in the corner. His new armor glowed faintly under the dim lights. Though his wounds hadn't fully healed, his gaze remained sharp, locked on her every movement. It was as if he already knew. This time, there could be no mistakes. She reached out, placing her hand gently on his head, warm on the surface, but ice-cold underneath. And Hugo, sensing the storm inside her, nuzzled his head into her palm once, quietly affirming what he had always done. No matter what, he would go with her, even if this was the last time. They arrived at the Riverside facility late into the night. A chill drifted from the water, tinged with the scent of rusted steel, damp concrete, and the unmistakable smell of places that had once held the nameless. It was an old processing plant, abandoned since the 80s, now converted into a maze of modern security cameras, reinforced doors, and at least one team of mercenaries brought in to clean up the last traces before the final exit plan was executed. Sarah knew if she didn't make it in time, everything, original records, medical files, biometric data, would be erased by high-pressure fire systems before dawn. But she also knew one thing for sure. Whoever had sent that message had never intended to give her a choice. They weren't planning to leave anyone alive. Not her, not her mother, and certainly not Hugo. Because if they truly believed Hugo was dead, there would be no need for this ultimatum. That could only mean one thing. They knew he was alive. And that only reinforced a far more terrifying truth. Someone inside Rodriguez's circle, or the FBI itself, was still feeding them information. Sarah slipped on her earpiece, checked the jamming signal Rodriguez had provided, and looked at Hugo. One last time. No commands, no gestures, just a look, a question that didn't need to be spoken. Hugo nodded, almost imperceptibly, and then they moved. Not as handler and dog, but as two warriors at the end of a war that had gone on too long, carrying not just duty, but the weight of every loss they couldn't count anymore. They crept through shadowed metal corridors, avoiding lights, following faint sounds rising from the lower levels. Discs being tossed into incinerators, living data erased like it never existed. Sarah took down a guard silently, a clean strike to the neck. Hugo steadied the man before he hit the floor. They moved door to door until they stopped at the largest room, its red lights blinking from the data destruction unit. Inside, an older woman was tied to a chair, blindfolded, yet still turning her head towards the familiar sound of approaching footsteps. Her mother. Sarah tightened her grip on her weapon, her eyes blazing, but her voice was calm as she leaned toward Hugo and whispered, "We've only got one shot." And Hugo, though still limping on a barely healed leg, lowered himself, muscles tensed, ready as he had been hundreds of times before. That night at the Riverside facility, none of them saw it coming. The clean sweep failed. There was no retreat, no time to trigger the file destruction system. Only gunfire cracking through the darkness and a bark tearing through the silence. A declaration, Hugo is alive. And Sarah never gave up. Above, gunfire thundered through the warehouse, where Sarah was locked in a deadly duel with the last gatekeepers of the darkness. Below, Hugo slipped away through a narrow path behind the storage unit, where the smell of blood, smoke, and fear tangled in a primal instinct he couldn't explain. He only knew it was pulling him toward something more urgent than survival itself. A faint, panicked gasp coming from behind a crumbling brick wall that opened into a deep, narrow tunnel. Without hesitation, Hugo lunged through the half-burnt barricade. His strong but cautious paws tested each step on the rusted staircase, where humidity choked the air and darkness pressed against every sound. The deeper he went, the clearer it became. This wasn't a temporary shelter. It was a sprawling underground maze, likely built for wartime transport, now repurposed into a prison for human beings treated like living cargo. At the second corridor junction, Hugo stopped. Ears up, nose in the air, he inhaled once, then growled low. Not a warning, a silent command to himself. Gas ahead. He pivoted, sprinting into a smaller tunnel reeking of cold stone and rusty water, then froze. There it was, a smell he would never forget. The scent of children's tears, mingled with blood and old rotting rope. 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, sat wide-eyed in the dark, loosely tied to a crumbling concrete pillar. Their breaths were shallow but not yet hopeless. In their eyes, when they saw Hugo approach, there was no fear, only the flicker of something fragile but bright. Hope. Hugo didn't growl, didn't bark. He lowered his head and began gently undoing the knots with his teeth, careful not to touch the bruises still fresh on their tiny wrists. The little girl let out a sob, but fell silent the moment Hugo pressed his nose to her cheek, quietly promising, "You're safe now." He guided them to link hands, then led the way. His silhouette flickered under the dying glow of emergency lights, armor on his back reflecting red like a heartbeat pulsing in the dark. At every turn, he paused, sniffed the air. He turned back when he caught the ozone tang of active sensors, rerouted down corridors without motion detectors. Once, he stopped dead, braced both front paws to the ground and hissed, then shoved all 3 children into a wall recess just as a delayed charge cave-in crashed down behind them, sealing off their original path by inches. And still he pressed on, as if born from the darkness only to find his way back through it. Every twist and step was guided by the instinct of a survivor, not one running from death, but one fighting to protect. When one of the children collapsed from exhaustion, Hugo returned, ducked under their arm, and lifted them with his back, moving forward as if their weight was his own. None of the circulating assets, as they were once labeled, had ever been treated like this, like lives worth guarding, worth leading out of a place that had treated them like objects. When they reached the vent shaft, a forgotten exit through the riverside reeds, Hugo staggered. His breathing was ragged, his injured leg trembled, but still, he pressed his shoulder against the rusted grate and forced it open. Then, one by one, he nudged the children through it, eyes never leaving their backs until all 3 had run into the arms of the rescue team summoned by Sarah's emergency signal. Only then, only once they were safe, did Hugo finally collapse at the edge of the damp grass, head resting against the cool earth, eyes closing, not from pain, not from exhaustion, but as if offering a quiet prayer. The mission in the dark is done. Hugo, he couldn't speak, couldn't argue, couldn't testify to the media, but in that maze, where no human voice could reach, he became the only voice that mattered, the one that led 3 children out of the place that had swallowed hundreds. And when Sarah found him, sprinting to his side, falling to her knees and wrapping her arms around him, she didn't have to say a word. She buried her face into his neck, where mud, smoke, blood, and belief all lingered, and she knew, if anyone had earned the right to be called a savior, it was Hugo, the silent hero who lit the way through the darkest nights. The moment the last of the children were led safely out of the maze and Hugo collapsed from exhaustion, Sarah knew it was time. Time to face the source of all the darkness head-on, and no one else could do it for her. 1 hour later, with data in hand, evidence encrypted from Hugo's device, and a full list of the surviving victims, she sent out the recording of Chen and Attorney General Phillips's conversation to the Federal Internal Media Network. No narration, no commentary, just the cold, unfiltered voices of those who thought they stood above morality, letting the truth speak for itself. And like a beast cornered, they didn't hide. Instead, they pulled her into one last game, where nothing was left but the killing blow. A message was sent to Sarah, no threats attached, just an address, a remote site far from the city, once a shipyard near Lake Lanier, later converted into a logistics hub and scrubbed clean from all official records. When she arrived, Hugo was still by her side. His body moved slower now, but his eyes remained the same. Calm, sharp, protective. Even if he had only one breath left, he would use it to keep her safe. The metal doors opened. Inside, no ambush, no gunfire, just a wide, dimly lit yard. And in the middle, 4 children stood perfectly still, like statues. On each of their chests was a strange device, red lights blinking in sync. At the far end, atop a raised steel platform, stood Chen, eyes cold behind dark glasses, and next to her, none other than Phillips, still in his polished suit like he'd just stepped out of a Senate hearing. His voice echoed with practiced calm, like a political speech written days in advance. "You have the data. We have the time. It's a simple deal, Collins. Drop it or watch 4 lives explode in the next 50 seconds. Sarah didn't move. Every sound in her head disappeared, except the pounding of her heartbeat, matching the pulse of the blinking red lights. But before she could take a step, Hugo moved forward, not charging, not growling. He walked slowly, low to the ground, step by careful step, as if even the air shifting might rattle the trembling children. One of them, a boy in the center, began to cry, silently, tears streaking his dirt-stained cheeks. Hugo stopped no more than 5 steps away and simply sat. He tilted his head, ears lowered, gaze steady. Not commanding, not afraid. Just a look. The same one Sarah had seen on so many sleepless nights in the hospital after her first failed mission. Saying, "It's okay, I'm here." The boy looked back. His hands trembled, then slowly began to move. And that was all Sarah needed. She rushed to his side and knelt. She didn't even need to look to know what kind of device it was. Emotion-triggered explosives, calibrated to heart rate and biometric panic responses. If the children panicked, the devices would signal a detonator somewhere nearby. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from knowing she only had one chance. Hugo didn't budge. He remained perfectly still, eyes locked on the child, a silent anchor in the storm. And somehow that stillness worked. The boy's heart rate began to slow. Sarah disarmed the first device, then the second, the third, and finally the last, each time with Hugo's gaze holding the children steady, as if his very presence willed the world to stay quiet just a little longer. When the final device came free from a tiny jacket, Sarah pulled the 4 children into her arms, shaking with adrenaline and relief. Only then did Hugo rise. He turned to face the platform above, where Chen and Phillips were no longer silent. His eyes met Sarah's for a fleeting second. No words, just a command passed in silence. End this. Now, the final confrontation wasn't an explosion. It was collapse from within. Chen reached for her weapon, but Hugo's growl ripped through the air like a blade, cutting through their illusion of control. Phillips stepped back, fear flashing across his face for the first time. And just then, Rodriguez's strike team stormed in from all sides, every escape sealed, every gun aimed. In the sound of handcuffs snapping shut, in the sobs of rescued children, in the quiet stillness of Hugo's eyes. Calm, finally, Sarah knew. The war was over. No more hiding, no more fear, and the last light had finally broken through the night they had walked together, side by side, from the very beginning. Just when it seemed everything was finally over, when the special ops team had surrounded the abandoned factory, when the children had been brought to safety, and when the handcuffs were about to snap shut on the man who once stood at the summit of power, Phillips took one last step back, not to surrender, but to draw a hidden pistol from his waistband. His eyes flashed with the cold desperation of a beast cornered, and in that final breath, he didn't aim at the agents. He pointed the gun straight at Sarah, the one who had exposed the web of lies he'd spent a decade weaving. The gunshot rang out without warning. No one had time to react, except Hugo. There was no hesitation, no growl, no need for thought. Hugo launched forward like lightning cracking through a storm. His body soared, intercepting the bullet in mid-air just as it tore toward Sarah. The impact shook his frame. A choked grunt escaped his throat as the bullet pierced deep into his left side, ripping through armor already damaged from the rescue earlier. Blood splashed out, dark and fast, soaking the fur that once stood as a symbol of bravery. But Hugo didn't fall. He landed, faltered for the briefest moment, then growled, eyes blazing like fire in a winter storm. He stood his ground, his body trembling, but he did not back down. He stayed between Sarah and death. Sarah, stunned into stillness, only felt the burning warmth against her wrist, Hugo's blood soaking through her sleeve, hot and urgent, and in that frozen instant their eyes met. No words, no sound. Just one final exchange said everything. He still chose to protect her, no matter the cost. She didn't let heartbreak stop her. Her hands moved automatically, weapon raised, aim locked, and with 2 clean shots she fired. Phillips collapsed. His gun flew from his hand. His eyes stayed wide open, not in fear of death, but in disbelief that the very dog he had once ordered to be wiped out at all costs had become the force that brought down everything he'd built. For a few seconds, no one moved. The entire factory fell into a crushing silence. Then, Sarah dropped beside Hugo. Blood had soaked the cracked cement floor, but he was still breathing. Weakly, slowly, but he was still fighting. His eyes were open, searching for hers, and the moment they met, she knew he was holding on. As long as she was there, he wouldn't let go. "Not today, Hugo," she whispered, voice breaking, hands pressed against the wound, trying to hold his life in place, refusing to let it slip away. Rodriguez rushed in, shouting for medics, but he too paused when he saw Hugo, still on his feet, though his legs were failing him, though the blood wouldn't stop. Sarah held Hugo's head in her hands, her forehead touching his, just as they had done so many nights before, after near-death missions, after every impossible moment they survived together. This time, though, her tears weren't from fear. They were in awe, because she was witnessing a strength greater than anything she'd ever seen. Not from a soldier, but from a soul that had never once wavered in its purpose. Hugo didn't fall when the bullet tore through him. He stayed standing, blocking the wind, the fire, and even death itself, for the one he called family. And even after Phillips, the final enemy, had fallen, Hugo remained, not as a victim, but as a symbol that could not be broken. Not by bullets, not by violence, but by the darkness he had already lit up with the fire of his own heart. As the sirens of the ambulance cut through the night and Hugo was lifted onto the stretcher in Sarah's arms, her hand still gripping his front leg, as if letting go would cause everything they'd fought for to vanish, the task force led by Rodriguez initiated an emergency lockdown of the entire factory complex. Amid the chaos of arrests, seized evidence, and overlapping radio chatter, one item stood out: a particular hard drive, removed from Phillips's primary device, hand-delivered by Rodriguez himself to the Federal Cybersecurity Center, where a decryption team had been standing by for months. No one said it aloud, but they all knew. If this drive didn't hold what they needed, all the sacrifice, including Hugo's blood, would be swallowed in silence. Then, at 3:12 a.m., in a high-security room, the final layer of encryption cracked. A massive stream of data began to unfold, slowly, clearly, like a locked door finally giving way after years of resistance. Names emerged: congressional advisors, financial board chairmen, CEOs of major transport conglomerates, senior officers from 3 different states, even diplomatic representatives from an international organization, all connected by an underground network of shadow payments, encrypted communications, illegal human transport, and a system designed to create a false front of humanitarian resettlement, which was, in reality, the most sophisticated human trafficking ring ever uncovered. That very morning, the national media exploded. Urgent bulletins aired back to back. Major news outlets reported on the Atlanta raid, the downfall of a black finance syndicate, and the shocking public exposure of high-ranking elites. But among the flood of names dominating headlines, 2 names stood out. Not from politics or corporate empires, but from a K-9 unit once accused of overstepping boundaries, and a dog labeled too aggressive for community service. Sarah Collins and Hugo, human and dog, not only survivors but leaders of a fight against a darkness the system had ignored for years. Images of Hugo, bandaged, lying in an ICU bed but still awake, eyes fixed on the doorway every time Sarah entered, spread rapidly across social media, alongside hashtags like Justice with Hugo, Jotjot Hero Dog, and Ketonino of the People. Viral videos followed, Hugo leading children out of the maze, Hugo calming the boy strapped with explosives, Hugo taking a bullet for his partner, each clip striking a nerve with viewers, even those thought to be beyond emotion, bringing many to tears. Outside the hospital, where Hugo was recovering, people began gathering, bringing flowers, letters, and crayon-drawn notes from children. Thank you, Hugo. Logically, the dog who wasn't afraid. Zrania, I want to be Hugo's friend. Sarah, still in her uniform stained with dried blood and dust, stood silently at the glass doors, watching the line grow under the early sunlight, her heart a swirl of emotions too deep to name. She didn't care for medals. She never needed the spotlight. All she had ever wanted was for Hugo to be seen for what he truly was. Not a tool, not a piece of trained equipment, but a living soul, with a heart, with intelligence, and the power to change the world, even if it was just through one gentle look in the dark. Now, the truth had burst wide open. The enemy had fallen, and Hugo, even while lying motionless in a hospital bed, had become the loudest voice for loyalty, bravery, and unconditional love. A reminder that some heroes don't need to speak, don't need to be celebrated with speeches. They just need to stay exactly where they're needed, at the moment they're needed most, and never give up. After the truth was laid bare, after the harsh sentences were handed down to those who once held power, and the applause echoed from every corner of the country, what Sarah longed for wasn't fame or celebration. It was something simpler and far more profound, a place truly meant for 4-legged warriors like Hugo, for souls once wounded, once labeled as beyond saving, but who had somehow found their way back into the light. 3 months after Hugo was honored before the entire National Security Force, the Hugo Project was officially launched. Not with brass bands or waving flags, but on a quiet morning, where sunlight streamed through newly painted kennels, glinting off clean concrete floors and rows of young trees planted along the porch. The center wasn't just a facility for physical treatment. It was a home for emotional healing. For dogs once abandoned, once forced to fight, once seen only through bars and pain. Each area was designed to be open and nurturing, with training spaces, recovery rooms, music therapy zones, and sunlit playgrounds where trauma was soothed not by commands, but through patience and care. At the heart of it all, in the center of the main training field, stood Hugo, not just as a bust carved from black marble, but in living form. Now, an honorary training advisor, he wore lighter armor, but his gaze remained unchanged, quiet, steady, always forward, just as it had been the first day Sarah saw him in that holding facility. Every day, Hugo walked the grounds with Sarah, not to chase shadows anymore, but to walk beside those who, like him once, were timid, frightened, unsure, but never incapable of love. Among them was a pit bull named Hope, a simple name, yet full of meaning. She had been found chained to a rusty pipe in an abandoned warehouse, once used by the trafficking network. Her eyes were sunken from hunger, her body marked with deep scars. No one dared approach her in the early days. Her growls weren't just defense. They were the cries of someone who had given up. But within a week, Hugo, through a calm no one could explain, entered Hope's kennel without being attacked. He didn't get too close. He simply lay near the gate, letting her see she wasn't alone. On the third day, Hope stepped closer, her legs trembling, but her eyes no longer turning away. By the 5th day, she was walking beside Hugo in the training yard, still pausing sometimes, glancing toward him, and each time, Hugo would tilt his head, give a soft wag of his tail as if to say, "We can do this, as long as we go together." Now, Hope knows how to stay still when a hand reaches out, to lie down at a signal, and to rest her head in the laps of children in the special trauma therapy program. And every time she does, Sarah's eyes fill with tears, not just for the progress, but for the rebirth, just like Hugo's once was. In Hope, she saw everything Hugo had overcome: darkness, fear, and invisible wounds too deep to name. Beneath the old tree in the training yard, where Hugo now lies peacefully beside Hope, their tails just barely touching, a quiet tether between two warriors once deemed lost, Sarah knew the Hugo Project wasn't just a rehabilitation center. It was the start of something new, a place where forgotten lives could find purpose again, a place where old scars were cherished, not hidden, as proof that courage never truly fades. And all of it began with Hugo's first look, the moment he chose not to give up. That morning, before the sun had fully risen above the trees east of the training center, the first light of dawn cast a soft golden hue across the rooftops, the dew-soaked grass, and the black stone statue of Hugo. The carved eyes didn't look lifeless or distant. They looked as if they still breathed, still felt, still waited for something not yet finished. Sarah stood on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand, but her gaze never left Hugo, who was quietly making his usual morning rounds along the perimeter fence. His posture remained calm and steady, though his pace was slower now, and the scar on his side reminded anyone who saw him that he had once walked the edge of death. A line of vehicles pulled up at the front gate, and without a word, Sarah knew who they were. The ones who had once been names on that terrible list, the very lives Hugo had helped her save with his blood. Leading the group was Emily, the young woman once found locked in a car trunk on that fateful night, now standing tall, her eyes steady, her smile carrying the warmth of rebirth. Beside her were the children Hugo had let out from the underground maze, the teens who once trembled in cold detention rooms, and adults who bore scars both visible and buried in memory. But today, they brought something different. Small nameplates, hand-drawn pictures of a dog in armor, and a handcrafted wooden box holding the highest civilian medal awarded by the state governor. Yet the one it was meant for was not human. Without being called, Hugo paused in the center of the yard. He lifted his head as Emily stepped forward. He didn't bark, didn't move. He simply stood there, ears drooping slightly, tail gently wagging, his eyes filled with something that almost looked like confusion, as if he didn't understand why these people were walking toward him, for him. A dog who had once been marked for termination. Emily knelt, lifted the box, and her voice trembled in the crisp morning air. "None of us would have survived without you. None of us could have believed in good again if we hadn't seen it in your eyes. Hugo, you didn't just save lives. You saved the humanity in those of us who had lost all hope." Sarah walked over, sat down beside Hugo, and wrapped her arms around him the way she had countless times before. But this time, she wasn't embracing a wounded warrior or a trained animal. She was holding a living legend. Hugo rested his head in her lap, not from fatigue, but as if to say he understood. That every drop of blood, every wound, every day of being misunderstood and pushed aside had led to this. A world where lives once deemed worthless were finally seen for what they truly were. Applause rippled softly across the training field, not loud, but tender, like a light rain brushing leaves. Young dogs from the rehabilitation center were led out one by one. Each carried their own story, their trauma, but their eyes were all drawn to Hugo, a symbol they somehow recognized instinctively. And there, in front of them all, Hugo stood, not because of the medal now clipped to his collar, but because of the eyes watching him, waiting for him to lead the way, just as he always had, through the long journey of blood and light. Sarah placed a hand gently on his neck, over the medal, and whispered so only he could hear, "You're not a discarded war dog anymore, Hugo. You're a hero, you're hope, you're the new beginning for all of us." And Hugo remained, not rushing, not roaring, just present, with the heart of a soldier who never gave up, with the eyes of a teacher who never stopped believing, and with the instinct of a being who needed no words to understand the meaning of redemption. As the sun climbed fully into the sky, its light caught on the medal over his chest, reflected across the fence, the young grass, and into the watching eyes of Hope, who sat quietly in the distance. And Sarah knew their journey wasn't over. Somewhere there would always be another soul needing a guide, and Hugo would always be ready to lead, silently, but brighter than any spotlight in this world. Hugo's journey wasn't just a story of a dog's bravery. It was a quiet epic about love, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty. From a discarded fighter, he became a hero who saved hundreds and inspired a new generation, not only of wounded dogs, but of people learning how to rise again from the shadows. And what about you? If given the chance, would you believe in a soul that the world once deemed broken? Would you leap trust, just like Sarah did, and walk side by side into something extraordinary? If this story touched your heart like it did ours, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales about silent heroes who change the world with one step, one glance, one embrace, and sometimes just a gentle wag in the dark.